Raymond Ray Carter had known peace once. It was a strange concept to a man who had spent most of his life fighting wars across the galaxy. As a retired soldier of the Galactic Peace Corps, Ray had seen everything from the dark recesses of space to the high-tech battlefields of enemy planets. He'd lost friends, made enemies, and endured traumas that would haunt him until his last breath. But none of that had prepared him for the quiet life he now led on the planet Darvik 7, a backwater outpost where the only thing that seemed to grow in abundance was boredom. Ray had chosen Darvik 7 for its isolation, a planet largely forgotten by the galaxy's major players. Its days were long, its nights cool, and its inhabitants peaceful. Or at least, that's how it used to be before the Three-Lac Empire arrived. The Three-Lacs were a warrior species, known for their military conquests and their belief in the superiority of their physical prowess. To them, honor was everything, and strength was the ultimate measure of one's worth. When they established a settlement on Darvik 7, Ray wasn't particularly concerned. He'd fought Three-Lacs before during his time in the Corps, and despite their brutish tendencies, they were at least predictable. Most of the time, they kept to themselves. But recently, things had started to change. Ray first noticed it when he went into the local settlement to pick up supplies. The Three-Lacs had begun walking the streets in groups, their hulking, armored figures towering over the planet's native population. They made no effort to hide their disdain for the Darvokians, who were a small, peaceful species, more inclined to farming and trade than war. Ray, too, caught their attention. The Three-Lacs had a way of singling out those they deemed weak, and to them, Ray, a retired human living alone in a dilapidated farmhouse, was an easy target. It started with looks. The Three-Lacs would stare at him, their eyes glinting with curiosity and scorn as he walked past them in the marketplace. Then came the whispers, in their guttural language, filled with mocking laughter and sneers. Ray, used to this kind of behavior from his years of service, brushed it off at first. He was an old man, living a quiet life. He wanted no trouble, but the Three-Lacs were relentless, and what began as simple insults soon escalated into something more dangerous. One evening, Ray was sitting on the porch of his modest home, watching the twin suns of Darvik 7 set over the horizon. The colors were beautiful, hues of purple and orange that stretched across the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. It was one of the few pleasures he allowed himself, to sit in the quiet, away from the noise of the universe, and just be. But that night, the Three-Lacs had other plans. A group of them approached his home, their heavy footsteps echoing in the twilight. Ray heard them before he saw them, the distinctive clank of Three-Lac battle armor, a sound he knew all too well from his days on the battlefield. He sighed, placing his drink down on the small table beside him. His hand instinctively drifted to his side, where, for so many years, a weapon had always been holstered. But there was no gun there now. He was retired. That life was behind him. Raymond Carter, a voice boomed from the shadows. It was Corgan, the leader of the Three-Lac group, a massive figure even by their standards. His armor glinted in the fading light, and his face, though partially hidden behind a visor, wore a cruel smile. Ray didn't respond immediately. He just stared out at the horizon, hoping they'd lose interest and leave him in peace. But Corgan was not the type to be ignored. "You fought in the Galactic Wars, didn't you?" Corgan continued, stepping closer. "Hard to believe someone like you could have survived. Must have been easy work, hiding behind your fancy human tech." Ray's jaw tightened. He knew what Corgan was doing. The Three-Lacs believed in physical strength above all else, and to them, the human reliance on technology was a sign of weakness. They couldn't understand the strategy, the discipline, the resilience that human soldiers possessed. To them, it was all about brute force. "I've got nothing to say to you, Corgan," Ray replied calmly, not taking his eyes off the sunset. "Why don't you head back to your camp and leave me in peace?" Corgan chuckled, a deep, menacing sound. "Peace? You don't deserve peace, human. You live on our land now. The Three-Lac Empire rules here. You should be honored we even speak to you." Ray said nothing, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. But inside, his anger was building. He had fought for peace. He had bled for it. And now these arrogant soldiers thought they could take it from him? "Come on, old man." Another Three-Lac soldier sneered from behind Corgan. "Show us what you're made of. Or has your species finally gone soft?" Ray's fists clenched. He had spent years trying to distance himself from violence, trying to leave that part of his life behind. But these Three-Lacs were pushing him, testing him, and every fiber of his being told him to fight back. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he stood up slowly, turning to face the group. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Leave now." Corgan laughed. "Or what? What will you do, human? Call for help? You're all alone here." Ray's eyes flicked toward the small communicator device hanging on the wall inside his house. It was old, a relic from his days in the Galactic Peace Corps, but it still worked. And it still connected to people he hadn't spoken to in years, people who would come if he asked. "I don't need to call for help," Ray said quietly. "But if you keep pushing me, you're going to regret it." Corgan's smile faded. For the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with anger. "You're not in charge here, human. The Three-Lac Empire rules this planet now. We do as we please. And if you don't like it, maybe it's time you were reminded of your place." With that, Corgan stepped forward, towering over Ray, his fist raised. Ray's hand twitched toward the communicator. He wasn't ready to make that call yet. Not yet. But if the Three-Lacs kept pushing him, they were going to find out just how dangerous a retired human soldier could be. Chapter 2. Escalation of Hostilities. The harassment didn't stop with Corgan's taunts. Over the next few days, Ray found himself under siege. The Three-Lacs had made it their mission to push him to the edge, to force him into a confrontation that he knew would end badly, for them or for him. And Ray wasn't ready to lose everything he'd worked so hard for. Not yet. It started small. The day after Corgan's visit, Ray found the fence surrounding his property knocked down. He assumed it was some animal at first. Darvik 7 wasn't without its fair share of wildlife. But upon closer inspection, the claw marks were too precise. These were no accidental break-ins. The Three-Lacs had left their calling card. They were letting him know they could reach him, anywhere, at any time. That evening, Ray fixed the fence quietly, trying to ignore the growing pit of anger in his stomach. He had fought in wars, survived in the darkest corners of the galaxy, seen things that would make lesser men crumble. And here he was, repairing his fence like an old man too stubborn to admit defeat. But the Three-Lacs weren't done. The following morning, Ray woke to find his crops destroyed. The small field of vegetables he had painstakingly nurtured for months was now nothing but a ruined mess of torn plants and upturned soil. The Three-Lacs didn't need food. Their settlement had plenty. This was about power, about showing Ray that they could take away his peace one piece at a time. Ray stood in his field, staring at the devastation. The suns were barely rising, casting long shadows across the land, and yet the weight of the morning pressed down on him like never before. His patience, long his strongest asset, was wearing thin. Inside his house, the communicator device hung on the wall, untouched. He glanced at it, knowing that one call could bring an end to this. But that wasn't how Ray worked. Calling for help was a last resort, a sign that he couldn't handle things on his own. And Ray Carter had never needed anyone's help to survive. As the days passed, the harassment grew more intense. The Three-Lacs became bolder, approaching Ray's house in groups, shouting insults from the road, daring him to come out and face them. Corgan was always there, a towering presence at the center of it all, smirking from beneath his visor. "Come on, Carter," Corgan shouted one evening, his voice booming across the quiet landscape. "Show us what that human spirit is made of." Or has the great Ray Carter finally gone soft? Ray, sitting on his porch as usual, didn't respond. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the twin suns were setting once again. But inside, he was boiling. Each insult, each act of vandalism, was wearing down the walls he had built to keep the violence at bay. One night, they pushed him too far. It was late, well past the point where even the wildlife had gone to sleep. Ray was resting in bed, finally finding some peace in the silence. But that peace was shattered by the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. Ray was on his feet in an instant, years of military training kicking in. He grabbed the small, simple blaster he kept under his bed, a weapon he hadn't touched in months, and moved silently through his house. As he approached the main room, he saw them, 3 Three-Lac soldiers, all of them in full armor, standing inside his home. One of them had knocked over a chair. Another was going through his belongings, while the third stood by the broken window, his claws still gleaming from the glass he'd shattered. They hadn't noticed him yet. Ray, with the stealth and precision of a seasoned soldier, crept closer, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his blaster. He could take them down right now, end this madness once and for all. But that wasn't his way. Not anymore. Instead, Ray took a deep breath and stepped into the light. You've made a mistake. The three lax turned, surprised to see him standing there, weapon drawn but not raised. The one by the window sneered. What are you going to do, old man? Shoot us? Ray's grip tightened, but he didn't raise his weapon. I've given you plenty of warnings. This is your last chance. Get out of my house. The three lax closest to Ray, a younger soldier with bright red markings on his armor, laughed. We do what we want, human. This is three lax territory now. You're lucky we've let you live here as long as we have. Ray said nothing, his eyes cold and calculating. He had dealt with men like this before, soldiers who believed their power made them invincible. But Ray knew better. Get out, Ray repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Corgan, who had just entered through the door, smirked. Or what? What are you going to do, Carter? Call for help? The Galactic Peace Corps doesn't care about this planet. You're all alone. Ray's gaze flicked briefly to the communicator on the wall. The call he had been resisting for days was closer to becoming a reality with every passing second. He had held back, hoping that the three lax would eventually leave him alone. But it was clear now that they had no intention of stopping. You're going to regret this, Ray said quietly, his voice calm but laced with warning. Corgan stepped closer, towering over Ray. No, Carter. You're the one who's going to regret staying on this planet. You should have left while you had the chance. Ray didn't flinch. He had faced down bigger threats than Corgan in his time. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't soldiers following orders. This was personal. The three lax wanted to break him, to prove their superiority by forcing him into submission. Ray had had enough. Without another word, he lowered his blaster and walked over to the communicator. The three lax watched, confused at first, but then Corgan's smirk returned. Calling for backup, old man? Think some soldiers are going to save you? Ray didn't respond. He simply activated the communicator and keyed in an old code, one he hadn't used in years. It took only a moment before the line connected. Caldro's here, a voice said on the other end, gruff and to the point. Caldro's, Ray said, his voice steady. It's Ray, Carter. There was a pause, and then the voice on the other end changed, growing more serious. Carter? What the hell are you doing calling me after all these years? I need a favor, Ray said simply, glancing at the three lax, who were now watching him with growing suspicion. Caldros hesitated, but then his tone hardened. You know what it means if I come, right? Ray nodded, though Caldros couldn't see him. I know. Do it. Caldros let out a low whistle. You sure? You don't call in something like this unless it's serious. Ray looked directly at Corgan, who was now glaring at him with narrowed eyes. I'm sure. Caldros was silent for a moment, then said, All right, Carter. We'll be there in 12 hours. Ray disconnected the call and turned to face the three lax, his expression unreadable. What did you do? Corgan demanded, his voice laced with unease. Ray didn't answer. He simply walked back to his porch, sat down in his chair, and watched the horizon as the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky. Chapter 3. The Arrival. 12 hours had passed, and the quiet tension around Ray's house was palpable. The three lax hadn't left. Instead, they loitered around his property, watching him closely, confused but increasingly suspicious. Ray sat on his porch as he always did, calm and stoic. But inside, he was counting down the minutes. Corgan paced impatiently near the front of Ray's house, his eyes darting between his men and the human sitting calmly in his chair. The unease had grown over the last few hours. Despite their bravado, the three lax couldn't shake the feeling that Ray's quiet confidence meant something. What do you think he's waiting for? Asked one of the younger soldiers, his eyes nervously flicking to the horizon. I don't care what he's waiting for, Corgan snapped. He's just trying to scare us. The human has no real power here. This planet is ours. But Corgan's words rang hollow, even to his own ears. The human had made that call, to someone, and though Corgan didn't know who or what was coming, the way Ray had spoken suggested it was something significant. Ray, on the other hand, knew exactly what was coming. The contact he had made was an old one, someone he had hoped never to reach out to again. Caldros wasn't just an ordinary soldier. He was the commander of a highly specialized unit that dealt with galactic conflicts the public never heard about. If Caldros was coming, it meant one thing. Ray had escalated this far beyond a simple dispute with some 3 lakh bullies. The waiting was the hardest part. Ray sipped his morning brew, trying to keep his thoughts from drifting too much. It had been years since he'd last worked with Kaldros. They had fought together in some of the worst battles the galaxy had ever seen. And while Ray had walked away from that life, Kaldros had stayed. If Ray's old friend was still as sharp as ever, things were about to change drastically for the 3 lakhs. As the suns began their slow descent toward the horizon, the stillness of the afternoon was shattered by the unmistakable roar of engines. The 3 lakhs, who had been lounging around Ray's property, immediately jumped to their feet, their eyes turning skyward as the sound grew louder. Ray didn't move. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his expression unreadable. "What is that?" one of the soldiers muttered, looking up into the sky. "A ship." Korgan frowned, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his blade. No ship lands on Darvik 7 without clearance from the Empire. But this wasn't an ordinary ship. As it drew closer, it became clear that this was no mere transport vessel. The craft was sleek, matte black, with no visible markings, a design that Ray recognized immediately. This was a ship built for stealth, for rapid deployment in hostile environments. It wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. Whoever was on that ship was more than enough to handle whatever they encountered. The 3 lakhs backed away from the house, their bravado faltering as the ship descended slowly, the roar of its engines kicking up dust and debris. It landed just beyond Ray's property, settling with a soft hiss as its engines powered down. For a few moments, there was only silence. Korgan exchanged nervous glances with his men. "Stay alert," he growled. "We don't know who or what that is." The ship's hatch opened with a soft, mechanical hiss, and out stepped a small group of figures, their movements precise and controlled. They wore dark armor, sleek and form-fitting, designed for both speed and durability. Their helmets obscured their faces, but the way they moved left no doubt. These were seasoned fighters, professionals who had seen more than their fair share of combat. At the head of the group was a tall figure, broader than the others, with a commanding presence that even the 3 lakhs couldn't ignore. He moved with the confidence of someone who had been in charge for a long time, and as he approached Ray's house, his helmet retracted, revealing a face that Ray hadn't seen in years. "Kaldros," Ray said, standing up slowly. Kaldros' eyes locked onto Ray's, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Carter," he replied, his voice gravelly but warm with familiarity. "It's been a long time." Ray nodded. "It has." The tension in the air was thick. The 3 lakhs watched the exchange in silence, unsure of what to make of it. Korgan, his hand still on his blade, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice wavering slightly as his gaze swept over the newcomers. "This is 3 lakh territory. You have no right to land here." Kaldros turned his head slowly, his eyes cold and calculating as they landed on Korgan. 3 lakh territory, you say?" His tone was dangerously calm. "Last I checked, this planet was neutral. Or have you forgotten the treaty?" Korgan bristled at the mention of the treaty. The 3 lakhs were part of an empire that had long tried to expand its influence through conquest, but they were bound by certain galactic agreements that limited their reach. Darvik 7 was one of the planets designated as neutral ground, free from military occupation. "This human doesn't belong here," Korgan spat. "He's trespassing on our land. We were just reminding him of his place." Kaldros raised an eyebrow, his expression hardening. "Reminding him of his place?" He glanced back at Ray. "This man is a veteran of the Galactic Peace Corps. He fought in wars to keep the galaxy safe. And you think you have the right to harass him? To destroy his home?" Korgan's eyes flicked nervously to his men. The other 3 lakhs shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence now wavering under Kaldros' scrutiny. We didn't know," one of the soldiers muttered. "We thought he was just a weak old man." Ray, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "You made a mistake." Korgan's jaw clenched, his pride wounded. "He's still human," he growled. "We are 3 lakhs. We don't bow to anyone." Kaldros chuckled darkly, stepping closer to Korgan, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the 3 lakh leader. "Bow. I don't care if you bow, but you will respect him." Korgan's hand tightened on his blade, but before he could make a move, Kaldros' soldiers raised their weapons, aiming them with deadly precision at the 3 lakhs. The tension exploded in an instant, the standoff teetering on the edge of violence. Caldro's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. I suggest you walk away. Now. Corgan hesitated, his eyes flicking between Caldro's and his men, then to Ray, who stood calmly beside him. The realization that he was outmatched, that he had vastly underestimated the human veteran, finally sank in. With a frustrated snarl, Corgan turned to his men. We're leaving. The other three lax, relieved to avoid a fight, quickly followed their leader as they retreated from Ray's property. Corgan shot one last venomous look at Ray before he stormed off. Caldro's watched them go, his expression unreadable. Once they were gone, he turned back to Ray. Looks like you've still got a talent for making enemies. Ray smiled wryly. Some things never change. Caldro's grinned, clapping a hand on Ray's shoulder. Good to see you again, old friend. Ray nodded, his expression softening. Likewise. Thanks for coming. Caldro's grin faded slightly as he glanced toward the horizon. You sure you want to stay here? The three lax won't give up that easily. Ray looked out at his quiet, isolated land, the place he had called home for the past few years. I'll be fine, he said quietly. I've dealt with worse. Caldro studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, but if you ever need backup again, you know how to reach me. Ray nodded, watching as Caldro's and his team made their way back to the ship. The engines roared to life once more, and within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of their departure. Ray sat back down on his porch, the silence of the evening settling around him once again. He knew the three lax would be back eventually, but for now, he had his peace. And if they ever dared to cross him again, well, he had plenty of old friends willing to make another call. Chapter 4. The Consequences. The days following Caldro's departure were quiet. The three lax had left Ray alone, their boisterous and aggressive presence evaporating after Corgan's humiliation. For the first time in weeks, Ray could go about his life without the constant gnawing tension of wondering what new trouble would come his way. He tended to his crops, repaired his damaged fence, and found himself actually enjoying the quiet. But Ray, ever the soldier, knew this was merely the calm before the storm. The three lax weren't known for backing down, especially not when their pride was on the line. Ray understood their warrior culture, how honor, once bruised, had to be restored. Corgan wasn't the type to forget humiliation, and the others in his unit would be expecting some form of retaliation. Ray had sent a powerful message by calling in Caldro's, but he hadn't won the war yet. Ray's suspicions were confirmed on the fifth evening after the confrontation. As dusk settled and the twin suns began to dip below the horizon, Ray spotted movement in the distance. He was sitting on his porch as usual, his keen eyes recognizing the distinct silhouette of approaching three lax soldiers. But this time, there were more of them. A lot more. Ray stood from his chair, his body immediately going on high alert. His years of training kicked in, his mind quickly assessing the situation. There were at least 33 lax soldiers now, all heavily armored, their weapons gleaming under the fading light. This wasn't just a group of bullies looking to harass an old man. This was an organized detachment. They were here for blood. Corgan led the group, as expected, but the usual smug expression on his face was gone. He looked deadly serious, his eyes fixed on Ray with a cold, hard determination. Behind him, the other three lax stood in disciplined formation, their postures tense and ready for battle. The stakes had changed. Ray felt a knot tighten in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had faced worse odds before. The three lax might have numbers, but Ray had the advantage of experience, and the knowledge that help wasn't far if things went south. Corgan stopped at the edge of Ray's property, his eyes blazing with anger. You thought calling your little friends would solve this, Carter? He spat, his voice dripping with venom. You think you can humiliate me in front of my men and just walk away unscathed? Ray crossed his arms, his stance relaxed but ready. I warned you, Corgan. You pushed me, and I responded. You could have walked away and left me in peace. But now you're back, which means you still haven't learned your lesson. The three lax soldiers behind Corgan shifted uneasily. They had heard the stories about Ray, about his past, his connections, and his impressive military record. But Corgan wasn't one to be swayed by fear or caution. He had a point to prove. This ends now, Corgan growled, stepping forward with his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial blade. You're on three lax territory, and by the authority of the Empire, we're reclaiming this land. You have two options, leave and never return, or face us in combat. Ray's eyes flicked over the assembled soldiers. They were all armed with advanced 3-lac weaponry, energy blades, plasma rifles, heavy armor. The smart thing to do would have been to retreat, to avoid a confrontation he couldn't possibly win on his own. But Ray Carter had never been one to back down. "I'm not leaving," Ray said simply, his voice steady. "This land isn't yours to take. And you're making a mistake coming after me like this." Corgan sneered, his eyes narrowing. "No one's coming to save you this time, human. Your friend Caldros isn't here to protect you anymore. You're alone." Ray's lips tightened into a thin line. He knew that if he tried to fight, he wouldn't stand a chance. But he wasn't here to fight them. Not yet. He had one final ace up his sleeve, something Corgan and his soldiers weren't expecting. Ray raised his hand and tapped the small device clipped to his belt. The communicator. "I'm not alone," Ray said calmly. Before Corgan could respond, the sky above them rumbled with the sound of distant engines. It started as a low hum, barely audible at first, but it quickly grew louder, more menacing, until the air was filled with the unmistakable roar of approaching ships. Corgan's expression shifted from arrogance to confusion. He looked up, his eyes widening as several dark shapes appeared in the sky, rapidly descending toward Ray's property. The 3-lac soldiers began to murmur among themselves, their disciplined ranks breaking as the unfamiliar ships closed in. Ray stood his ground, his eyes fixed on Corgan. "I told you not to push me." The ships touched down with a thunderous roar, their sleek black hulls gleaming under the fading light. The doors hissed open, and out stepped a dozen figures clad in dark armor, each one moving with the precision and confidence of elite soldiers. At the head of the group was Caldros, his face grim and unreadable as he approached. Corgan's confidence evaporated in an instant. His hand twitched toward his blade, but he didn't draw it. "You called them back?" he hissed, disbelief in his voice. "You think this will end well for you?" Ray didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to Caldros, who was now standing beside him. "You didn't have to come all the way back here for this." Caldros shrugged, his expression neutral. "I don't take chances when it comes to old friends." Corgan, sensing the shift in power, growled low in his throat. "This is 3-lac territory. You have no authority here." Caldros' eyes flicked to Corgan, his face hard as stone. "You think the Empire cares about your little games? You violated the treaty by trying to claim this land. You're the one with no authority here." Corgan took a step back, his hands still resting on his blade. The 3-lac soldiers behind him looked unsure, their earlier bravado now faltering in the face of the elite team that had just landed. Caldros gestured to his soldiers, who immediately raised their weapons, aiming them squarely at the 3-lacs. "You've got two options," Caldros said coldly, echoing Corgan's earlier words. "Walk away, or we make sure you don't get another chance." Ray watched as Corgan's eyes darted between Caldros, his own soldiers, and the heavily armed team standing before him. For a brief moment, Ray thought Corgan might make a move, might try to salvage some shred of honor by engaging in a final, desperate fight. But Corgan wasn't that foolish. Not with the odds so heavily stacked against him. With a snarl of frustration, Corgan spat on the ground at Ray's feet. "This isn't over, Carter. You might have one today, but I'll be back. And next time, you won't have anyone to call." Ray didn't flinch. He simply stared Corgan down, his expression as calm and composed as ever. "Next time, you won't get a warning." Corgan's eyes burned with fury, but he said nothing more. With a sharp gesture, he signaled to his soldiers, and they began to retreat, their weapons lowered but their pride wounded. As the 3-lacs disappeared into the distance, Ray let out a slow breath, the tension in his body finally releasing. He turned to Caldros, offering a small nod of gratitude. "Thanks for coming." Again. Caldros grinned, clapping Ray on the shoulder. "You've got a habit of attracting trouble, Carter." Ray chuckled softly. "Yeah, I guess I do." Caldros' expression grew serious for a moment. "You sure you want to stay here? The 3-lacs won't forget this. They'll be back, and next time, they might not be so easily scared off." Ray glanced out at his land, at the quiet fields and the peaceful horizon beyond. "This is my home," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving." Caldros nodded slowly, understanding. "All right, but if you ever need backup again, don't hesitate to call." Ray smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, Caldros and his team returned to their ships, the engines roaring to life once more. Ray watched them lift off, disappearing into the sky just as quickly as they had arrived. As the quiet returned to his property, Ray sat back down on his porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The Three-Lacs would come back eventually. He knew that. But for now, he had his peace. And when they returned, he would be ready.